In December 2023, I found myself back on dating apps after a rough breakup. My ex and I had split just before Thanksgiving, leaving the holidays feeling colder and emptier than usual. Friends kept telling me to put myself out there, so one evening, I gave in and downloaded Tinder. I wasn't expecting much, just some casual chats to pass the time. But then I matched with Emily. Emily's profile pictures immediately caught my eye. Her dark wavy hair framed a face with piercing blue eyes and a smile that seemed warm but mischievous. Her bio was witty, mentioning a love for Christmas movies, wine, and bad jokes. We started chatting, and she was quick to suggest we move the conversation to Snapchat. I hesitated for a moment, but then thought, why not? On Snapchat, our conversations felt easy and light. She teased me about my lack of holiday decorations after I posted a story of my undecorated living room, calling it the saddest bachelor pad she'd ever seen. I laughed, admitting that I hadn't had the energy to put up a tree or hang lights. That's when she suggested coming over to help me decorate. Her boldness was surprising, but I found it charming. After some hesitation, I agreed. We set the time for 8 p.m. That night, I spent hours cleaning my apartment, overthinking every detail. What if she thought my place was too small, too messy, too plain? By 7:30, my nerves were in overdrive and I almost canceled. But then a notification popped up. Emily had sent a message saying she was on her way. She arrived at 8:45, fashionably late. When I opened the door, I was struck by how different she looked in person. She was taller than I'd expected, nearly 6 feet, and there was an intensity in her eyes that hadn't been apparent in her photos. Her smile, while warm, felt slightly off, too practiced, too wide. She carried a small bag that she set down on the couch as she stepped inside. We sat and chatted for a bit, and while she was friendly, something about her energy felt jittery, almost nervous. She laughed a little too hard at my jokes and kept glancing around the room as if she were scanning it for something. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe she was just nervous. It was our first time meeting, after all. When I mentioned that I hadn't brought up my Christmas lights from the storage unit in the basement, she perked up and offered to help. I told her to wait in the living room while I ran down to get them. As I descended the creaky stairs to the basement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself I was overthinking and grabbed the box of lights quickly. When I returned to the apartment, Emily wasn't in the living room. Her bag was still there, but she was nowhere to be seen. I called her name, first casually, then louder. No response. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the bedroom, nothing. Panic started to creep in. My apartment wasn't that big, and there weren't many places to hide. Then I noticed something chilling. The kitchen window, which I always kept locked, was open. A cold draft blew into the room as I stared at the window. My stomach turned. Had she left through the window? Why would she do that? And more importantly, how had she unlocked it? My unease grew as I locked the window and returned to the living room. I grabbed my phone to message her, but before I could, the power suddenly went out. The apartment plunged into darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled to turn on my phone's flashlight. The narrow beam of light cast eerie shadows across the walls. That's when I saw her. Emily was standing at the end of the hallway, her silhouette motionless. Her tall figure was backlit by the faint glow of a streetlight outside. Emily? My voice wavered as I spoke. She didn't answer. Slowly, she stepped forward, her face coming into view. Her expression was blank, her eyes glassy and devoid of emotion. She raised her hand, and that's when I saw it, the blade of a knife glinting in the faint light. Panic took over. I stumbled backward, knocking over the Christmas tree. The sound of ornaments shattering filled the room as I bolted for the front door. She moved quickly, blocking my path with unnerving precision. I darted into the kitchen instead, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands were trembling as I dialed 911, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to the operator. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. Outside the kitchen door, I could hear Emily's footsteps, slow, deliberate. She was pacing, the sound of her shoes echoing in the silence. Then the footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. A loud bang on the door made me jump. She was trying to force it open. I grabbed a knife from the counter, though I had no idea what I would do if she broke through. My heart pounded as I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Suddenly, there was silence. No footsteps, no banging, just an eerie stillness. When the police arrived minutes later, they found the apartment empty. Emily was gone, along with my wallet and a few small valuables. Her bag, which had been left behind, was filled with random junk, old receipts, candy wrappers, and an empty water bottle. There was no ID, no phone, nothing that could tell me who she really was. The officers took my statement and searched the area, but they didn't find anything. Her Snapchat account had been deleted, and without her real name or any other information, there was little they could do. I spent the rest of the night sitting on my couch, too scared to sleep. Weeks later, I still think about Emily, or whoever she really was. Her face haunts me, that blank expression and those lifeless eyes. I don't know what her true intentions were that night, but I'm grateful I trusted my instincts and called for help. Christmas hasn't felt the same since, and every time I hear the creak of the floorboards, I can't help but wonder if she's come back. December 29th, 2023, was one of those brutally cold nights where even stepping outside felt like a punishment. My friend Matt and I had been invited to a New Year's party at a cabin about 2 hours from town. The idea was to escape the chaos of city celebrations and enjoy a quiet, snowy retreat with a small group of friends. The host, Lisa, was an old friend of Matt's. I'd only met her once, but she seemed nice enough, a bit quirky, but kind-hearted. We left late that evening, hoping to avoid icy traffic. The roads were already coated with snow, and the occasional gust of wind would sweep it into swirling eddies that danced across the pavement. Matt drove cautiously, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The GPS directed us onto a series of increasingly isolated roads until we found ourselves surrounded by dense forests, the trees looming like shadowy sentinels in the dim glow of our headlights. "Are we sure this is the right way?" I asked, staring at the GPS with growing unease. The blue line snaked through what looked like a void of nothingness. Matt glanced at me, his expression tense. "This is what Lisa sent me. Shouldn't be too far now." But the further we drove, the more the road seemed to deteriorate. What had started as a paved highway became a gravel path riddled with potholes, and eventually, even the gravel disappeared. We were driving on a dirt road, barely visible under the snow. The cabin wasn't supposed to be this remote, was it? "Maybe we should call her," I suggested. Matt agreed, but when he tried dialing, there was no signal. The cell towers must have been miles away. The unease in the car was palpable as we continued forward. The forest grew denser, the trees so close to the road that their branches scraped against the car windows. The GPS indicated we were only 5 minutes away, but something felt wrong. There were no other tire tracks in the snow, no signs of life. Just as I was about to suggest turning back, we spotted a faint light in the distance. "That's gotta be it," Matt said, relief evident in his voice. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating what appeared to be a cabin. But the sight didn't comfort me. The structure looked old, almost dilapidated, with peeling paint and sagging beams. The light we'd seen was coming from a single bulb above the front door, flickering weakly like it was on the verge of burning out. "Are you sure this is Lisa's place?" I asked, my stomach nodding. Matt frowned. "It's the only thing out here." We parked and approached the cabin cautiously. Snow crunched under our boots as we walked up the rickety porch steps. Matt knocked on the door, but there was no response. He tried again, louder this time. The door creaked open. "Hello?" Matt called out, his voice echoing into the darkness inside. There was no answer. The interior was eerily silent, save for the faint sound of wind whistling through cracks in the walls. Matt stepped inside, but I hesitated, a growing sense of dread holding me back. "Lisa?" Matt called out again, his voice more urgent. The cabin was freezing. If someone was inside, they weren't using the wood stove in the corner, which sat cold and untouched. The furniture looked old and mismatched, like it had been scavenged from thrift stores. But what struck me the most was the smell, a faint, metallic tang that made my stomach turn. "Maybe she went out for something," Matt suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. As we ventured further inside, I noticed something on the floor near the kitchen, a set of footprints in the snow. They led from the back door to the living room and then stopped abruptly. No outgoing tracks. Whoever had been inside was either still here or had vanished into thin air. "Matt," I whispered, pointing to the footprints. He followed my gaze and froze. The realization hit us both at the same time. We weren't alone. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a loud thud from upstairs. We both jumped, our eyes darting toward the staircase. Matt grabbed a fire poker from beside the wood stove, his face pale. "Stay here," he whispered. "Are you crazy? We should leave." I hissed back, but Matt was already heading up the stairs. I stayed rooted to the spot, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. The seconds stretched into an eternity as I listened to Matt's footsteps creak above me. Then, suddenly, I heard him yell, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" His voice was cut off by a loud crash, followed by the sound of something, or someone, bolting down the stairs. I barely had time to react before a figure came charging toward me. It was a man, his face obscured by a ski mask. He shoved past me and disappeared out the back door, vanishing into the snowy night. "Matt!" I screamed, running up the stairs. I found him lying on the floor of one of the bedrooms, clutching his arm. Blood seeped through his fingers where a jagged piece of glass had cut him. He was shaken but conscious. "We need to leave. Now," he said through gritted teeth. We stumbled out of the cabin and back to the car, not daring to look back. As we drove away, Matt told me what had happened. He'd found a man rummaging through a closet upstairs, stuffing items into a backpack. When Matt confronted him, the man lunged at him with a broken bottle. The only thing that had saved Matt from a more serious injury was the fire poker. When we finally reached a town with cell service, we called the police and reported the incident. They said they'd send someone to investigate, but we never heard back about what they found, if they found anything at all. To this day, I can't shake the image of that cabin, isolated and decaying in the middle of nowhere. And I can't help but wonder, if we hadn't shown up, what was that man planning to do? Last New Year's Eve, December 31st, 2023, started as a night full of excitement and anticipation. My fiancée, Jenna, and I were hosting a small get-together at the new house we'd moved into just a few months earlier. The house was an old colonial-style place in rural Massachusetts, surrounded by trees and a quiet road that barely saw any traffic. It was exactly what we'd wanted, charmingly isolated but still close enough to town for convenience. Our guests began arriving around 7 p.m., and by 9, the party was in full swing. The living room was alive with laughter and music, glasses clinking as everyone toasted to the new year. Outside, snow had begun to fall steadily, blanketing the world in an eerie silence that seemed to amplify the warmth and joy inside. Around 11 p.m., Jenna asked me to bring out some more wine from the basement. I grabbed the keys to the locked storage room where we kept our extra bottles and headed down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was unfinished, with exposed pipes and stone walls that always seemed damp no matter how much we ran the dehumidifier. The only light was a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows. As I rummaged through the shelves, I heard what sounded like a soft scraping noise coming from the far end of the basement. I froze, my breath visible in the cold air. It could have been the house settling, I told myself. Old places like this were full of strange noises. But as I stood there, straining to listen, the sound came again, louder this time, like something being dragged across the concrete floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice wavering. Silence. I quickly grabbed the wine and hurried back upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I didn't want to ruin the party by mentioning it to Jenna or our guests, so I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Midnight came, and we all gathered around the TV to watch the ball drop in Times Square. As the countdown began, I noticed something strange outside the living room window. Through the falling snow, I could see what looked like a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the yard. It was too dark to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable, tall and motionless, like it was watching us. "Hey, Jenna," I whispered, nudging her. Do you see that? She followed my gaze and frowned. See what? Out there, by the trees. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks on me, but my unease only grew as the night went on. By 1 a.m., the party was winding down, and our friends began to leave one by one. Jenna and I said our goodbyes and started cleaning up the living room, stacking plates and gathering empty bottles. That's when we heard it, a loud, deliberate knock at the front door. Jenna and I exchanged a glance. "Who could that be at this hour?" she asked. "I'll check," I said, grabbing a flashlight just in case. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the snow, undisturbed except for a single set of footprints leading up to the porch, and then back toward the woods. Was anyone there? Jenna asked when I closed the door. "No," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just a prank." We double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked before heading upstairs to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thud from downstairs. Jenna sat up beside me, her eyes wide. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know. Stay here." I grabbed the flashlight again and crept down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. The footprints were back, leading from the door into the house. I followed the tracks cautiously, my hand shaking as I held the flashlight. They led to the basement door, which was now ajar. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I pushed it open and shone the flashlight down the stairs. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, in the corner of the basement, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure crouched in the shadows, its face obscured by a hood. It looked up at me, and for a brief moment, we locked eyes. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes wide and unblinking. It didn't say a word, just stood there, staring. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, then ran upstairs to grab Jenna. "We need to leave." "Now," I said, my voice shaking. We grabbed our coats and keys and ran to the car, not even bothering to pack any bags. As we sped down the snowy road, Jenna asked, "What did you see?" I hesitated, not knowing how to explain it. "I don't know," I said finally, "but it wasn't human." We never went back to that house. The next day, I called the police and told them everything. They searched the property but didn't find anyone, or any evidence that someone had been there. But I know what I saw, and every time I think about that night, I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't woken up? New Year's Eve 2023 was supposed to be a quiet night. My brother, Ethan, and I had planned to celebrate at our family's lake house in northern Wisconsin. Our parents were out of town, so we had the place to ourselves. The house was nestled deep in the woods, with only a few neighboring cabins, most of which were empty this time of year. It was the perfect spot to relax, light a fire, and enjoy the snow-covered scenery. The evening started off uneventfully. We cooked dinner, watched some TV, and played a few rounds of cards. Outside, the snow was falling steadily, piling up on the porch and blanketing the frozen lake. By 10 p.m., Ethan suggested we go outside to light some sparklers he'd brought. I grabbed my coat, and we stepped out into the icy air, our boots crunching against the snow. As we lit the sparklers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The woods surrounding the house felt unusually still, the kind of silence that makes every sound seem amplified. I glanced around, my breath visible in the cold, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the dark outline of trees against the snowy landscape. "Stop being paranoid," I muttered to myself, shaking it off. By the time we went back inside, it was almost midnight. We made some hot chocolate and settled onto the couch to watch the ball drop. As the countdown began, Ethan got up to grab his phone from the kitchen. That's when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. I froze. It was almost midnight, and we were in the middle of nowhere. Who would be out here in this weather? The knock came again, louder this time. "Ethan," I called out, my voice trembling. "Someone's at the door." He returned, his brow furrowed. "Maybe it's a neighbor?" I shook my head. "All the cabins are empty. Nobody's supposed to be here." We stood in the living room, staring at the door. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and walked cautiously toward the door, while I stayed behind, clutching my phone in case we needed to call for help. "Who is it?" Ethan called out, his voice steady. There was no response. He unlocked the door and opened it a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The porch was empty, but there were fresh footprints in the snow, leading away from the house and toward the woods. "There's no one here," he said, shutting the door quickly and locking it. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Then who was knocking? Ethan didn't answer, and we decided to call it a night. We double-checked all the locks and windows before heading upstairs. My room overlooked the backyard and the edge of the woods, and as I pulled the curtains closed, something caught my eye, a figure standing at the tree line, barely visible in the moonlight. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was definitely a person, just standing there, unmoving. I grabbed my phone and snapped a picture, but when I looked at the screen, the figure was gone. I barely slept that night, and when morning came, Ethan and I decided to head back to the city early. As we packed up the car, I noticed something strange on the porch. Someone had written in the snow with their finger, "Come back tonight." We drove away without looking back, leaving the lake house behind. It was December 31st, 2023, and I had reluctantly agreed to babysit for my neighbors, the O'Briens. They had an elegant New Year's Eve party to attend, and I could use the extra cash. Their house was just a block away from mine in our quiet suburban neighborhood in Denver, Colorado. Watching their two kids, Mia and Dylan, wasn't a big deal. They were well-behaved and usually spent most of their time watching cartoons or playing with their dog, Cooper. The O'Briens left around 7 p.m., and everything started off fine. Mia, who was 6, was coloring in the living room, while Dylan, an energetic 8-year-old, was playing with action figures upstairs. Cooper, their golden retriever, dozed by the fireplace, occasionally lifting his head at the sound of passing cars. Around 8:30 p.m., the snow started falling heavily. I checked the weather app on my phone and saw a storm warning. The wind began howling, and the house groaned under the weight of the storm. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked and secure. I told myself the weather was nothing unusual for Colorado winters. By 9 p.m., Dylan came downstairs to watch a movie with Mia. I let them pick out a kid's film, popped some popcorn, and settled onto the couch. Everything felt peaceful until Cooper started growling. His ears perked up, and he stared at the front door, his lips curling to expose his teeth. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, my voice uneasy. He let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the door. Mia clutched my arm. "Is someone outside?" I peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. The porch light illuminated the snow-covered yard, but there were no footprints, no sign of movement. "It's just the wind," I assured them, though I didn't fully believe it. Cooper's growling stopped, but he remained tense, his eyes darting toward the windows. I tried to focus on the movie, but my heart was racing. At 9:45 p.m., Mia went to the kitchen to grab a juice box. A minute later, she came running back into the living room, her face pale. "There's someone in the backyard," she whispered, pointing toward the sliding glass doors. I jumped up and ran to the kitchen. The backyard was shrouded in darkness, but I could make out a figure standing near the fence. They were tall, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. They didn't move, just stood there, facing the house. My stomach dropped. I locked the sliding door and pulled the blinds shut. Dylan and Mia were clinging to each other in the living room, their eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Probably just someone passing through." I called the O'Briens, but the call went straight to voicemail. Next, I tried my parents, but they didn't answer either. The storm must have been interfering with the signal. I debated calling the police but hesitated. I didn't want to overreact. Cooper's growling resumed, louder this time. He stood in front of the front door, barking furiously. My hands trembled as I checked the peephole again. No one was there. But then I heard it, a faint tapping on the glass of the sliding door. I froze. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept back to the kitchen and peeked through the blinds. The figure was now closer, standing just a few feet from the door. I couldn't see their face, but they raised a hand and waved, a slow, mocking gesture. I backed away and grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer. "Stay here," I told the kids. "Don't move." Cooper's barking became frantic as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I stammered out my address, explaining the situation. They said an officer would be dispatched immediately. Minutes felt like hours. The tapping had stopped, but now there was a faint scratching sound coming from one of the windows. I couldn't bring myself to check. The kids were huddled under a blanket, their faces buried in Cooper's fur. Finally, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the living room. I ran to the door and let the officer in, relief washing over me like a wave. 2 more officers searched the property but found no one. There were footprints in the snow leading to the backyard, but they disappeared near the fence. "Could have been someone playing a prank," the officer suggested, though his tone wasn't convincing. He assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night. The O'Briens returned around midnight, apologizing profusely when I explained what had happened. They insisted I take extra money for my trouble, but no amount of cash could erase the memory of that figure by the fence. To this day, I wonder who or what they were, and why they were watching us. New Year's Eve, 2023, was supposed to be a quiet one for me. I had declined all party invites, opting instead to stay home and decompress from a hectic year. I had recently moved to a small house just outside Missoula, Montana. It was an old place with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was affordable, and the surrounding woods offered a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, I decided to treat myself to a simple dinner and a movie marathon. The snow outside had been falling steadily since the afternoon, blanketing the world in silence. My closest neighbors were about a mile away, so I figured it would be an uneventful night. Around 8 p.m., as I was midway through a horror film, the power went out. The screen flickered off, plunging the house into darkness. I groaned, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. I figured it was the snowstorm affecting the power lines. I bundled up and stepped outside to check the generator at the side of the house. The wind bit at my face, and the snow was coming down harder now, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I trudged through the snow, shivering, and reached the generator. Everything seemed in order, so I gave it a kick to restart it. It sputtered for a moment before humming to life. As I headed back to the house, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow leading up to my porch. They were fresh, definitely not mine, and far too large to belong to any animal. My stomach tightened as I followed the tracks to my front door. There was no sign of anyone, but the door was slightly ajar. I hesitated before stepping inside, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. Gripping my phone like a lifeline, I slowly made my way through the house, checking each room. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footprints had clearly led to my door, but there was no sign of anyone leaving. I locked the door and tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just a neighbor checking in, but deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I decided to pour myself a drink and keep the lights on. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, just creaks and groans I chalked up to the old house. But then I heard something unmistakable, a soft thud, like footsteps in the attic. I froze. I didn't even know the house had an attic. Grabbing a flashlight, I searched the ceilings until I found a small, square hatch in the hallway. It was slightly open, and a thin, dusty string dangled from it. My first instinct was to call the police, but I felt foolish. What would I say? That I heard footsteps in the attic? Instead, I decided to investigate. I grabbed the longest broom I could find and used it to push the hatch open further. A musty smell wafted down as I shone the flashlight into the darkness. "Hello?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. The flashlight beam revealed old insulation, cobwebs, and a few cardboard boxes. But just as I was about to lower the broom, I heard it, a raspy, shallow breath coming from the far corner of the attic. I dropped the broom and stumbled back, my heart racing. I slammed the hatch shut and ran to the kitchen to grab a knife. I dialed 911 with trembling hands, and explained the situation to the operator. They assured me an officer was on the way. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. I sat in the living room, clutching the knife, my eyes darting to every shadow. The snow outside seemed to glow in the moonlight, but the serenity only heightened my anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was in the attic was watching me. When the officer finally arrived, I practically ran to the door to let him in. I explained what had happened, and he immediately climbed up to check the attic. I waited at the bottom of the ladder, my breath fogging the air. The officer was silent for a long moment before muttering, "What the hell? What is it?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He climbed down, holding an old, tattered blanket and a small, rusted knife. "Looks like someone's been squatting up there," he said grimly. "There's a pile of trash and some makeshift bedding. You're lucky you called." I felt sick. The officer searched the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. He assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood for the rest of the night, but I couldn't sleep. The idea that someone had been living above me, watching me, was too much to bear. I moved out of that house a week later, leaving behind the snow-covered woods and the creeping sense of dread. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about the faint, raspy breath I heard in the attic. I'll never know who they were or why they were there. And maybe that's for the best.